I was lucky enough to marry Ree Smith, working together on our family ranch west of Pawhuska. I don't think she ever wants to see another feed bill for the...
What happens when a marriage built on 40 years of hard work is suddenly tested by something no amount of grit can fix? Wade Sutton had spent his whole life believing that strength meant never slowing down. His wife, Callie, had spent hers believing that love meant always showing up for everyone else first. Neither of them expected the year that would quietly rewrite both of those beliefs. This is the story of what happened when the Sutton Ranch, and the people who built it, had to learn a different kind of toughness. The Sutton Ranch sits on the edge of Briar Creek, a stretch of rolling grassland that's been in Wade's family since his great-grandfather first staked it out with barbed wire and stubbornness. For 3 generations, the rhythm of that land never changed. Cattle moved at first light. Fences got mended on a schedule nobody questioned. Wade ran it the way his father had, and his father before him, with a kind of quiet precision that the hired hands respected more than they ever said out loud. So when the ranch hands started noticing small shifts in how Wade operated, they knew something was different. He began handing off tasks he'd never let go of before. Cattle sales that he used to negotiate personally started going through his younger brother instead. Morning rounds he'd done himself for 2 decades were suddenly somebody else's job. A few people figured he was just getting older, finally slowing down the way ranchers eventually do. But the ones who knew him best understood it wasn't age. It was something else, something he wasn't ready to talk about yet. Running an operation that size takes constant attention. Wade had been on that land since before he could see over the hood of a truck, and stepping back wasn't just about rearranging his calendar. It meant rethinking who he was, after building his entire identity around never being anywhere else. The hands who'd worked alongside him for years noticed he started leaving earlier in the afternoons. His boots, usually caked in mud by sundown, stayed cleaner. His truck sat idle in the yard more often than it used to. It wasn't laziness. It was a man choosing, deliberately, to be somewhere else, with someone who needed him more than the herd did. Word travels fast in a small ranching community, and people started guessing. Maybe he was still dealing with an old back injury. Maybe money was tight. A few even wondered if the marriage was in trouble, though anyone who'd actually seen Wade and Callie together knew that wasn't it. The real reason was simpler than any of the rumors, and it would take months before anyone outside the family understood what it was. Callie had built a career out of being an open book. Her cooking blog, started years earlier almost as a hobby, had grown into a modest but devoted following, people who felt like they knew her family from her stories about ranch mishaps, holiday dinners, and the ordinary chaos of raising 3 kids on a working cattle operation. That openness was exactly what made people feel connected to her. So when her posts started coming less often, and looking more polished and personal, her readers noticed. The funny, rambling stories about kitchen disasters disappeared. What used to feel like a conversation started to feel like a highlight reel. Comment sections filled up with people gently asking if everything was okay. Callie would answer with a heart emoji and a reassurance, but the woman who used to overshare everything was suddenly holding things back. Her local cooking demonstrations, usually packed events at the county fairground, got scaled down too. She still showed up, but for shorter stretches, with more rest built in between. The community noticed the change in her energy before anyone said a word about why. Before the diagnosis, there was another moment that shook the family to its core. 2 years earlier, Wade and his nephew had been out fighting a grass fire when their truck rolled on uneven ground. His nephew was airlifted out with serious injuries. Wade, being Wade, refused an ambulance and drove himself to the hospital, only for doctors to find he'd fractured 2 vertebrae in his neck. It could have been so much worse. Doctors told him flatly that he was lucky to be walking at all. He wore a brace for months and was ordered to rest, which was about the hardest instruction anyone had ever given him. For the first time in his adult life, Wade had to sit still and let other people carry the weight he was used to carrying alone. Nobody talked much, at the time, about how that accident affected Callie. She'd come close to losing him. The man she'd spent her whole adult life beside had nearly died doing the work he loved, on the land his family had worked for 100 years. That kind of fear doesn't just fade once the cast comes off. She kept the household running, kept smiling for the cameras and the blog, and kept the panic mostly to herself. But the people closest to her noticed the way she'd glance at her phone a little too often once Wade went back to work. It was during a routine checkup, almost 2 years after that accident, that doctors found something that needed a closer look. Callie had been writing off her symptoms as ordinary exhaustion, the kind that comes from running a household, a small business, and a ranch guest cottage all at once. But the fatigue felt different this time. The headaches didn't let up. When she finally agreed to a full workup, the results changed the shape of everything that came next. The condition required real, ongoing management, medication schedules, dietary changes, and a level of unpredictability that made planning anything difficult. Some days, she felt almost like herself. Other days, getting out of bed took everything she had. For a woman who'd built her whole identity around being dependable, that loss of control was almost harder to sit with than the diagnosis itself. Wade drove her to every appointment. He sat in waiting rooms listening to explanations that were sometimes over his head, taking notes on his phone, so he wouldn't forget anything the specialist said. For a man far more comfortable diagnosing a sick calf than navigating a hospital hallway, it was a steep and humbling education. But he stuck with it, because that's what he understood partnership to mean. Wade had spent 50 years believing that the ranch came first, always, no matter what. That belief wasn't just a habit. It was practically a family religion, passed down from his father and grandfather before him. Stepping back from any part of it felt, at first, like abandoning something sacred. But when Callie's diagnosis came, the choice stopped being complicated. She needed him in a way she never had before, and he made his decision without much fanfare. He started letting go, not of the ranch itself, but of the assumption that he had to be the one doing everything, all the time. His brother took on more of the big decisions. His kids stepped up in ways that surprised even him. And Wade carved out space in his life, for the first time, that existed entirely for being present with his wife. It wasn't an easy adjustment. His father and grandfather had worked that land until their bodies simply couldn't anymore, and that had always been the measuring stick Wade held himself to. Choosing to step back while he was still capable felt, at first, like quitting. It took long conversations, with Callie, with his brother, and plenty of silent ones with himself out on the tractor, before he came around to a different way of thinking about it. Being present for the person he loved wasn't a failure of duty. It was just a different shape of the same thing. His brother, Denny, ended up carrying a lot of that weight. He'd always helped out around the operation, but now he was making calls that used to be Wade's alone. Cattle purchases, equipment decisions, negotiations with buyers. That kind of trust didn't come naturally to Wade, who'd been the one making those calls for decades. But Denny proved capable. The ranch kept running, and that success made it easier for Wade to keep showing up for Callie without the nagging guilt that he was letting the family business down. What stood out most about how Wade handled it was how quietly he did it. No big announcement, no dramatic speech. He just started showing up differently, and the people who knew him best noticed without needing an explanation. That was Wade's way, actions instead of words, and for once, it fit exactly what the moment called for. While Wade was rearranging his life around the ranch, Callie was facing her own version of the same problem. Her cooking blog had grown into something bigger than she'd ever planned. A small side business selling preserves and baking mixes out of a converted barn, plus the occasional cookbook deal. All of it depended on her showing up, in person, again and again. Her diagnosis made it clear she couldn't keep that pace. The barn store started running mostly without her, staffed by 2 employees who'd been with her for years and knew the operation almost as well as she did. She still dropped in when she felt up to it, but she stopped forcing herself through days that left her wiped out for a week afterward. Her writing changed too. Instead of posting on a schedule because it was expected, she started posting only when she actually had something she wanted to say. Readers noticed a shift, and most of them responded with more warmth than she expected. People, it turned out, connected just as much with honesty about limits as they had with the constant stream of content that came before. The Sutton kids, 2 of them mostly grown, one still finishing high school, responded exactly the way Wade and Callie had raised them to. The oldest started driving home more often, not for any special occasion, just to be there. The middle one took over bookkeeping for the barn store almost without being asked. The youngest, still living at home, picked up chores around the property that used to be someone else's job entirely. None of them talked about it much outside the family. That had always been the Sutton way. Share the good stuff, the funny stuff, the pretty pictures of ranch life, but keep the hard parts close. This situation didn't change that instinct. It just meant the hard parts got shared a little more, quietly, between people who loved each other enough not to need it spelled out. People who heard that Wade was stepping back, assumed it meant something final, like he was walking away from the life he'd built. But what he was really saying goodbye to was narrower than that, and a lot more specific. He was saying goodbye to the idea that work always came before everything else. Goodbye to the belief that showing up meant pushing through no matter the cost. Goodbye to the old idea, baked into him since childhood, that a man proves his worth by never slowing down and never asking for help. Callie's diagnosis forced both of them to figure out what actually mattered. Once you stripped away the habits and expectations they'd both been running on for decades, the ranch kept going, run by people who loved it as much as Wade did. The business kept going too, managed by a team who understood what Callie had built. What ended wasn't the ranch or the business. It was the exhausting insistence that they had to carry all of it entirely on their own. Rebuilding around new priorities wasn't comfortable. Both of them had spent their whole adult lives being the reliable ones, the people everyone else leaned on. Learning to lean on other people instead felt, at times, like losing something. But they kept at it, because the alternative, pretending nothing had changed, wasn't sustainable, and they both knew it. Wade started saying yes to things he would have automatically said no to a few years earlier. Taking an actual day off. Going with Callie to appointments in the city instead of sending her with one of the kids. Sitting still some evenings instead of finding one more thing that needed fixing before dark. Each of those small yes meant letting go of a little more of the rigid structure that had defined his whole life, and each one was a quiet, deliberate choice to put the marriage ahead of the work. Callie's version of letting go looked different. She had to get comfortable with not being the one everyone could count on for everything, all the time. The friend who always showed up, the mother with endless energy for every request, the blogger who never missed a post. Her diagnosis forced her to admit she'd been running on empty long before anyone else could see it, and that continuing that way simply wasn't an option anymore. These days, the Suttons have settled into a rhythm that looks nothing like the one they used to have, and neither of them would say they'd have chosen this path if given the option. But they're walking it together, the same way they've walked through everything else since they got married. Callie still cooks, still writes, still connects with the people who follow her work, just on her own terms and her own timeline now. Wade still works the land, still rides out at dawn some mornings, but he's no longer defined only by how much of himself he can pour into the ranch before dark. Mornings still start early, because that's simply how ranch life works, but there's less rushing built into them now. Wade makes sure Callie's taking her medication before he heads out. They eat breakfast together more often than they used to, a small habit that means more than it probably should. The ranch work continues, without Wade being the first one on horseback every single day, and it hasn't fallen apart without him. If anything, watching it run smoothly without his constant hand on every decision gave him something he didn't expect, a little bit of peace. Wade isn't saying goodbye to Callie, or to the life they built together. He's saying goodbye to the version of himself who thought strength meant never slowing down, never admitting he needed help, never putting his own family above the demands of the land. In letting go of that version of himself, he found a different kind of strength, the kind that knows when something has to change, and has the nerve to actually change it. That's the real story here. Not an ending, a shift in what mattered most, and the quiet, unglamorous work of living that shift out, one ordinary morning at a time.